Let's unpack this. Imagine it's the 1990s, the Cold War, this huge, decades-long struggle. It had just ended, and there was this feeling everywhere, this kind of collective sigh of relief, harmony, maybe. People were even talking about the end of history, like we'd reached this final stage of global peace. But then Samuel P. Huntington comes along and, well, drops a bombshell. His article, which then became the book, The Clash of Civilizations. Wow, it landed like a punch to the gut of all that optimism. Generated, more discussion than almost anything in international relations for ages, right? He asked this really provocative, kind of unsettling question. What comes next? What's going to dominate world politics now? And his answer, pretty direct. The next big conflicts, he said, they won't be about ideology, not really about economics either. They'd be between civilizations. And these conflicts, he argued, were the biggest threat to world peace.
That's absolutely right. And the thing is, the source material argues that what was happening right then, in the mid-90s, seemed to, back him up. It wasn't just some abstract future prediction. He was basically saying, look around, this is already happening. People were, increasingly defining themselves by these deeper things: ancestry, language, religion, customs, culture. The really critical distinctions, the source suggests, were becoming cultural, not political or economic. And global politics was kind of rearranging itself along these cultural lines.
Right. So for this deep dive, our mission really is to explore Huntington's central idea, this challenging thesis. We want to understand the forces he saw at play, and maybe think about what this whole clash of civilizations idea means for you, the listener, as you try to make sense of what's going on in the world today. We're going to pull out some surprising insights, specific examples, straight from the source. Okay, so let's start with the basics, his core concept, civilization. What exactly did he mean by that? He talks about them as the broadest level of cultural identity, built on shared ancestry, religion, language, history, values, customs, institutions too. It's about answering that fundamental question, who are we? Especially after the Cold War labels didn't seem to fit anymore.
Exactly. And the source lays out the major ones he saw shaping the world then. You've got Sinic, that's China, Vietnam, Korea. Then Japanese, Hindu, Islamic, Western, Orthodox, Latin American, and potentially African. The key takeaway is that for most people, this cultural identity is what's most meaningful. It's deep. The source puts it bluntly. Flags count, and so do other symbols of cultural identity, including crosses, crescents, and even head coverings. These aren't just superficial things, they represent fundamental belonging. Culture, he says, really counts.
That really hits home, the power of that kind of identity. And speaking of powerful, there's this quote in the source, it's pretty stark, attributed to a Venetian nationalist. He says, "There can be no true friends without true enemies. Unless we hate what we are not, we cannot love what we are." Wow.
And the source calls this an unfortunate truth for leaders and scholars. The implication, I guess, for you listening is this idea that maybe tragically, groups need an other, an enemy, to really define themselves. It's a sobering thought about us, about humans. And if you link that idea to global politics, it starts to explain why the real hotspots, the flashpoints, tend to flare up on the fault lines between these civilizations. Think about the examples the source gives. Bosnia, Chechnya, Kashmir, the Middle East. These weren't just random disputes. Huntington saw them as manifestations of these deep civilizational divides where different cultural worlds collide. It's where the abstract becomes very real and often violent.
Okay, so if the world's conflicts are clustering on these civilizational fault lines, what's driving it? Is it just ancient history bubbling up, or are there bigger shifts happening? Huntington talks quite a bit about the West's position in all this, doesn't he? He brings up this idea of the West's relative decline, which sounds a bit, jarring maybe, but the source points to data showing the West's share of world population, economic output, manufacturing, even military power, shrinking since its peak earlier in the 20th century. Like, its share of the global economy dropping significantly in just a few decades. That's a major shift in the balance of power.
It is. And what's really key is how this perceived decline happens alongside the rise of what Huntington termed challenger civilizations, particularly East Asia and Islam. In East Asia, you have this incredible economic surge. Japan, the Four Tigers, China starting its rise, Southeast Asia. This economic power led to a new cultural assertiveness, a kind of pushing back against the West, emphasizing their own values, sometimes shared Confucian ideas like thrift, family focus, work ethic, discipline. It wasn't just about catching up economically. It was a challenge to this idea that Western values were the only way, this Western universalism. And at the same time, you see what he called the Islamic resurgence. This was fueled in part by huge demographic growth, especially a massive youth bulge, lots of young people aged 15-24. This group, the source notes, provided well, ready recruits for fundamentalist movements and also drove migration patterns. That population explosion in Muslim countries, as the source puts it, was fundamentally changing global politics.
It's funny. The common thinking for so long was that as societies modernize, religion fades away, right? Secularization. But Huntington flips that. He says religion is actually making a comeback, becoming more important in this new era. How does he explain that? It seems counterintuitive.
Well, his argument is that modernization, it disrupted traditional ways of life, old identities. It created a kind of vacuum. And religion, both the established forms and the more fundamentalist movements, stepped into that gap. It offered people a sense of identity, community, meaning, purpose, in a world that felt like it was changing too fast. It met a deep need. And this connects directly to those demographic trends we mentioned. The source gives this really striking projection. It suggests Christianity's share of the world population peaked around the 1980s and is set to decline. But Islam's proportion, it will continue to increase dramatically, hitting maybe 20% around the year 2000, potentially surpassing Christianity later and maybe reaching 30% by 2025. And then there's that very direct quote for you to think about. Christianity spreads primarily by conversion, Islam by conversion and reproduction. In the long run, however, Muhammad wins out. Very provocative statement.
So, okay, these big shifts are happening. Cultural, demographic, power balances. What does this mean for the actual nature of conflict? Let's look closer at these fault line wars he identifies. These aren't like classic wars between nation states fighting over territory necessarily. They're mainly clashes between groups from different civilizations. And the source notes, quite starkly, that the overwhelming majority of fault line conflicts have taken place along the boundary looping across Eurasia and Africa that separates Muslims from non-Muslims.
Yeah, and what's really telling is how identity itself changes and hardens in these conflicts. The Bosnia example is powerful here. Before the war, people might have identified as Serb, Croat, or Muslim in a more maybe casual or cultural way. But during the war, these became deep, defining civilizational identities. Bosnia went from being called the Switzerland of the Balkans, multicultural, to the Iran of the Balkans because of increasing Islamization and a rejection of that earlier multicultural ideal, even by Muslims who had once embraced it. And this ties into what he calls kin-country rallying. It's like when conflict breaks out on a fault line, countries belonging to the involved civilizations tend to support their kin. Germany and Austria helping the Croats, Russia and Greece backing the Serbs, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, other Muslim nations rallying for the Bosnian Muslims. It becomes a wider civilizational affair. The U.S. was kind of the odd one out, the non-civilization anomaly for its support of the Bosnian Muslims, not fitting that pattern neatly. The source also touches on something it calls a Muslim propensity for conflict. It points to data from the 1980s showing Muslim countries having, on average, higher military force ratios, higher military effort indices compared to others, suggesting a link somehow between Islam and militarism in that period. And then there's that very controversial phrase from the source, Islam has bloody borders. It's presented alongside quantitative data attempting to back it up, based purely on the frequency of intercivilizational conflicts involving Muslim groups.
That phrase, Islam has bloody borders, it's incredibly loaded. Does Huntington offer context? Is he trying to avoid just painting with a broad negative brush? How does he frame that finding?
The framing in the source is very much analytical, almost clinical. It presents it as an empirical observation based on the data it compiled regarding conflicts along those specific civilizational boundaries. It links it to the military indices mentioned earlier. It's portrayed not as a value judgment on Islam itself, but as a description of a pattern of conflict observed in the data available at the time. He saw it as a statistical reality arising from various factors in those specific regions.
Okay, understood. An analytical claim based on his data, however controversial. So, moving beyond specific wars, what about the overall relationship between major civilizations? The source talks about a kind of quasi-war between Islam and the West, ongoing really since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Not a full-scale declared war, but this continuous low-level conflict. Terrorism from one side met with air power, covert ops, economic sanctions from the other, a sort of simmering, undeclared struggle.
And this feeds directly into another huge issue, weapons proliferation, WMDs especially. The source describes what it calls a Confucian-Islamic connection. This idea that China and also North Korea played a key role in transferring conventional and non-conventional things like nuclear know-how, missile parts, chemical weapon precursors to Muslim states. Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya are mentioned. And there was this perceived lesson from the first Gulf War for non-Western leaders, according to the source. Don't fight the United States unless you have nuclear weapons, and maybe even more starkly. If you have nuclear weapons, the United States won't fight you.
Right.
Whether that's true or not, the perception, the source argues, drove proliferation way up the security agenda for the West. It created this dangerous dynamic.
Wow. That really highlights the stakes. Okay, this leads us to another really interesting concept from Huntington, these torn countries. What are those exactly? Nations caught between worlds.
Basically, yes. Countries where the main culture belongs to one civilization, but the country's leaders are actively trying to pull it into a different civilization. It creates this massive internal tension, a sort of national identity crisis. The source gives some great examples. First, Turkey. Kemal Ataturk's massive push in the 20s and 30s to modernize, westernize. Secular state, Latin alphabet, new laws explicitly rejecting the Ottoman Islamic past. But the source notes the West, especially Europe, never fully accepted Turkey as one of them. Think of the EU membership struggles. So Turkey then started to turn toward Tashkent, looking to lead the Turkic peoples in Central Asia instead. Torn. Then there's Russia, torn since Peter the Great, really. Always this split between the Westernizers, the Atlanticists wanting closer ties to Europe and the US, and the Slavophiles or Eurasianists, the nationalists, emphasizing Russia's unique identity, separate from the West. Yeltsin tried the Western path, but nationalist feelings kept bubbling up, pushing back, still playing out today, obviously. Mexico's another one. Leaders trying to shift its identity from primarily Latin American to North American, integrating economically with the US and Canada through NAFTA. And maybe surprisingly, Australia. Leaders there made a push to redefine Australia as part of Asia, despite its clear Western cultural roots. But the source says, Asian nations often kept Australia at arm's length, citing cultural differences, Australia's maybe more direct communication style, its strong stance on democracy and human rights, which sometimes clashed with regional norms. The source sums it up pretty bluntly. Odd men don't get in. Tough being culturally different.
That's fascinating. It really makes you look at certain countries today through a different lens, doesn't it? You see these internal pulls and pushes. So if these countries are torn, how successful can these attempts at cultural transformation actually be? Huntington introduces this idea of the Western virus and cultural schizophrenia. What's that about?
It's another provocative phrase. It suggests that while you maybe can't completely reject Western influence in today's world, the virus part, trying to fully westernize like Ataturk did, usually fails. The schizophrenia part. The core insight, according to the source, is that for non-Western societies to modernize successfully, they need to do it on their own terms. They have to build on their own cultures, traditions, values, institutions. Think of Japan modernized incredibly rapidly, but remained distinctly Japanese. It's not about rejecting modernity, but shaping it to fit your own civilization. And this also brings up challenges within the West itself. The source mentions concerns that could lead to cultural suicide or political disunity, things like rising crime, family breakdown, less community involvement, or decline in social capital. But maybe more pointedly, it critiques multiculturalism within the US, arguing it undermines a common American culture by promoting separate group identities. The fear expressed in the source is that this could lead to a disuniting of America, especially if new immigrant groups don't assimilate into the dominant, historically European-based culture. It poses this really stark question for you to consider. Will the de-Westernization of the United States, if it occurs, also mean its de-Americanization? Is American identity fundamentally tied to its Western roots?
That is a heavy question, a really deep one to wrestle with. Okay, so given all this potential for friction, these fault lines, the rise and fall of powers, what's the way forward? How do we avoid this clash turning into major global conflict? Huntington doesn't paint an entirely bleak picture, does he? He notes the West's huge impact, its role in starting modernization, but also that its own path follows patterns seen in other civilizations. He says a major war between core states isn't inevitable, but it's definitely possible.
Right. And to try and prevent that worst-case scenario, he lays out 3 basic rules for peace in this multi-civilizational world. First, the abstention rule. Core states, the main powers in each civilization, need to stop intervening in conflicts inside other civilizations. Hands off. The source explicitly says this is a, quote, truth some states, particularly the United States, will undoubtedly find difficult to accept, given historical tendencies. Second, the joint mediation rule. When conflicts do break out on the fault lines, the core states from the involved civilizations should work together to mediate, contain, or stop them. And third, the commonalities rule. People in all civilizations should actively look for and build on the values, institutions, and practices they actually share. Find the common ground.
That common ground idea is interesting. The source mentions Singapore as an example, right? A place trying to actively build that shared identity. You have significant Chinese, Malay, Indian populations there, different civilizational roots. But they made a conscious effort to define a common Singaporean culture, emphasizing things like nation before community, family as basic unit, consensus, harmony, racial and religious tolerance. It shows it's possible, at least on a national scale, to try and bridge these divides deliberately.
Exactly. And ultimately, the source brings it back to the West's role. It argues that the West's uniqueness comes from its specific values: Christianity's legacy, pluralism, individualism, rule of law. And its main job now isn't to try and remake the world in its image, but to preserve and renew those unique qualities within itself. As the source puts it, Western civilization is valuable not because it is universal, but because it is unique. Focus on maintaining your own identity, not imposing it.
So wrapping this up, the big takeaway from Huntington, from this deep dive, seems to be that the world after the Cold War didn't become flat or harmonious. Instead, it became defined, maybe even more deeply, by cultural identity, by these large civilizational blocks and the fault lines between them. It's a multipolar, multi-civilizational reality.
And given those realities, the challenges, the potential for really serious conflict, especially with rising powers and spreading weapons, Huntington's ideas, whether you agree with them or not, they really force you to think hard, not just about what we are politically or economically, but who we are culturally, civilizationally, in this complex, interconnected, yet deeply divided world. So the question for you listening is, how does this perspective change how you read the news, how you understand global events? Do you see these cultural currents playing out beneath the headlines?
Lots to think about there. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the clash of civilizations. We really encourage you to keep exploring these complex, important ideas on your own. Until next time.